Michael Cohen, President Trump's self-described fixer and former personal lawyer, is finally going to face Congress. After several delays, Cohen is scheduled to appear in public before the House Oversight Committee next Wednesday. That appearance will create a striking split screen, as his former boss, President Trump, will be 8,000 miles away in Vietnam, getting ready for his summit with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. According to the Democratic chairman of the Oversight Committee, Eli Cummings, Cohen has been cleared to discuss the president's debts and payments relating to any efforts to influence the 2016 election. His compliance with campaign finance law, conflicts of interest, the Trump International Hotel in Washington, the Trump Foundation, and President Trump's truthfulness. It will not include questions related to ongoing investigations into Russia's effort to influence the U.S. political process. Cohen is also set to appear privately before the Senate and House Intelligence Committees next week. In August, Cohen pleaded guilty to multiple crimes, including 2 campaign finance violations related to hush payments to an adult film star and a former Playboy model on behalf of Donald Trump. Cohen reports to prison on May 6th. For more, I'm joined by Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com, and David Frum, senior editor at The Atlantic and a former speechwriter for George W. Bush. David, the Nixon comparisons are always overused, but I'm going to go to one anyway because I can just remember, but I'm reading about Nixon in the final days of Watergate. He went overseas a lot. He looked to score big points overseas to sort of distract. And you've got the reports here of the Mueller thing maybe coming to a head. You've got Cohen next week. And where's Trump going to be? He's going to be over there in Vietnam.
But President Nixon had real successes. The breakthrough to China, that was real. The arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union really did make the world safer. President Trump's so-called appearances are not successes. What he is doing in Vietnam is another in a long line of retreats from previous American positions on North Korea, retreats that would have shocked the Republican Party as it existed until 2 years ago.
What do you see him trying? Is this a president who's trying to find some way to put a win on the board no matter what?
This is a total branding exercise. In the same way that he tried to persuade people that Trump University was better than Princeton, he is trying to persuade people that the yielding to the North Korean position in return for nothing. The North Koreans have made no permanent concessions. They have suspended some tests. That's true. That's good. But nothing has changed. But the American position has changed forever. And not only vis-a-vis North Korea, but of course we have a much worse relationship with South Korea, with the United States constantly making these absurd, petty demands for small sums of money from South Koreans and frightening the Japanese half to death.
Jason, again, we talk about the split screen, but I mean, that will be one of the stories next week. You're going to have the president trying to make this sort of play on the international stage. You're going to have Michael Cohen there sort of giving this open public testimony. Let me ask you, what are you listening for from Cohen next week?
Steve, it's not so much what I hear from Cohen. It's going to be the questions from the Democrats. You have a lot of people on the Oversight Committee. You have that sort of new group of freshman congressmen who are really trying to make a name for themselves. Where are they going to go with their questions? Are they just going to ask about 2016? Or are they going to try and expose a lot of Trump's other behavior to sort of set the groundwork for attorney generals and state senators who are probably going to be doing investigations based on things that Cohen is saying? Let's not forget that Cohen's real importance in this Trump administration is not just that he was Trump's fixer, but he knows where all the bodies are buried. He knows other crimes this president might have engaged in. He might also know crimes or misdemeanors or bad behavior that were engaged in by Trump's associates, by his family. So my question is going to be, how many of these congressmen are going to dig into those answers, and will we get something explosive? I really don't think that what the president's doing in North Korea is going to distract anybody. Most Americans care about what comes out of Cohen's mouth.
Well, for decades, Michael Cohen has worked as Donald Trump's personal lawyer, famously telling a reporter, remember this one, he would take a bullet for his boss. All of that changed the day federal investigators raided his office, his home, and hotel room in April of last year. Lanny Davis, who is now Cohen's legal advisor, told John Dean, that was Richard Nixon's lawyer, that Cohen will, quote, pull the curtain back and we will hear true stories of Trump's complicity in crimes and his immoral, bigoted, and morally vacant character in specific, detailed personal anecdotes. Just days after the FBI raided Cohen's office and home, President Trump tweeted out this: "Remember, Michael Cohen only became a rat after the FBI did something which was absolutely unthinkable and unheard of until the witch hunt was illegally started. They broke into an attorney's office." Lanny Davis doing a good job raising the bar of expectations in terms of what's going to come out of this. I guess the skeptical question somebody might ask is, Cohen's been through the legal process here. If there was anything particularly juicy or explosive that he could prove there, wouldn't that have been the forum for?
I think that's a good guess. One of the things we learned from Cohen, and this is the larger context, is how squalid all of these Trump scandals are, and how comparatively petty. Now look, hundreds of thousands of dollars is a lot of money to most people. But if you're theoretically a billionaire, then hundreds of thousands of dollars are like dimes. Would you steal a dime? Most people wouldn't. So if Donald Trump is the person he says he is, then the whole Cohen legal operation does not make sense. So when he draws back the veil, one of the things that he will show is what the Trump operation really was. It was an operation where people were scrounging for what would be, for a billionaire, puny sums of money and taking incredible legal risks for reasons that don't make sense if the story Donald Trump tells about himself is a true story.
And Jason, the other sort of piece of context for this, too, is we have been talking this week about that new reporting in the New York Times that President Trump, a couple months ago, according to the Times, went to his acting attorney general, Matthew Whitaker, and suggested a different prosecutor for the Cohen case as that was being adjudicated. A prosecutor Trump believed might be an ally, might be favorable to him, was told, hey, he's already recused himself. Right. You can't do that. But that was the president perhaps being mindful of what Cohen might say.
Well, yeah, Steve, the president is concerned about Cohen embarrassing him. The president is concerned about Cohen making him look bad. But the reality is every bit of juicy, important information from Cohen has already been squeezed out. Mueller knows what he needs to know. The Intelligence Committee, their closed-door hearings, they've already found out the questions about Russia. Most of what Cohen can do is remind us, like Lanny Davis' statement, remind us of things we already know. Oh, President Trump is a bigot. We kind of knew that already. He bojangles for pennies. He steals money from charities on his own behalf. He's kind of a terrible guy, and he's kind of a grifter. None of these things are new. But the president was hoping, well, maybe if I can manipulate things from the top here or there, it can change some of the legal consequences. There is absolutely nothing that Cohen will say next week that hasn't already been chewed through, sorted, and already put into files by the people who Trump really needs to worry about, which is the Mueller investigation and anything that might be done by oversight committees in Congress.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.